They almost try to make him into a Catholic since he was born a Catholic and so on. Well, again, you just don't find this when you read major biographies and studies of Hitler and Nazi Germany.
Well, he had a hatred for Christianity. He developed a hatred for Christianity.
Yes, and that's again, I point out some of his attitudes, again, as given in some of the leading historians of Hitler. So again, these are not mysteries of history. This is in their case, a massive distortion of history, again, to support their ideology.
Not that we're here to debate, but I have seen reputable sources say Hitler did declare himself an atheist and then didn't, and then did.
Yeah.
He seems to have mostly been insane.
And in a way, it's beside the point. I mean, it's sort of a silly debate. But it is clear that in the long run, he saw Christianity as an enemy, and ultimately, they had to take care of the Jews first, but the churches might be next, and that's pretty clearly stated by major historians on the topic.
Yeah, they had formed their own Nazi Christianity, actually, when they called positive Christianity, and then they killed people.
Right, yes, they had their own Aryan German version and so forth. Yeah, I mean, unlike Stalin, Hitler didn't go after the churches directly. As a matter of fact, he really tried to entice them, but that's a whole other story.
It is. The Stalin, it was interesting too. It was you mentioned this in the book, something called the League of Militant Atheists.
Yes.
Which was a Stalinist group, and to be honest, I look at some of the new atheist literature, and some of it looks like it's taken out of that. And because some of the propaganda, I'm sorry, I use the word propaganda, but it seems like some Soviet propaganda on Christianity has made its way into contemporary popular best-selling literature.
Well, I think that's a fair enough critique of the more extreme new atheists, or whatever one wants to call them, militant atheists. But yeah, there's some, and that group, the League of the Militant Godless, I mean, that was meant to be a popular organization that was going to help get rid of religion on a popular level. And they would, for example, take a church and set it up as a museum of atheism and try to show that science proved it and all that sort of thing. But again, everybody knows this. And at one point, there's one of the, I forget which one of Dawkins, or maybe it was Hitchens, attacks a book that was about the League of the Militant Atheists. It was a perfectly good book. I've read the book. And again, historians could debate some of the conclusions, but it was a serious study of the whole topic. And yet it was just dismissed. I think it was by Hitchens, but it doesn't matter. It didn't come to the right conclusions from their point of view.
You also write a little on Mussolini, again responding to their points. Would a fair summation of your chapter on the 20th century be that basically, and don't let me put words in your mouth, would it be basically that on the 20th century they managed to get Hitler, Stalin, and Mussolini wrong?
Yes.
Yeah, fair way of putting it. They managed to get all three of those wrong. That was my conclusion, so now I'm automatically smarter because Borden Painter agrees with me. Which is, again, a joke, but okay. And that's what that chapter was mostly about. Now we have the period in Europe from 1600 to 1900, which you've also go into with those guys. Again, what was your basic thrust there?
Well, I think it was, again, to point out that they had some of the main, in each of these chapters, I think I was trying to show that some of the main themes and topics that are standard in looking at European history are distorted or absent in their version. So in that particular chapter, for example, they use some of the stuff from the 19th century to show this war between science and theology, religion and science, based basically on two late 19th century books. And I'm not an historian of science, but I've read a good bit, and in some of my courses I would talk about the rise of science in the 17th, 18th, 19th century. And so historians of science don't use that narrative anymore. This is an example of an out-of-date, sort of Victorian, late 19th century view of science and religion. And historians of science have abandoned it because it distorts the history as they're trying to discover and unravel it. So there was that issue, and I think the other issue that very prominent in this period is the rise of the modern state from the 17th century on, and they're quite oblivious to that. They don't seem to pay. So that means they don't understand the ways the intermix of religion and politics. Often religion of course was used as a prop for monarchs and that sort of thing. We know that, but they were quite oblivious to that, I thought.
So just to drill down a little bit more, the two themes you mentioned there are a 19th century view of religion. Now, I think I know what you mean there, but correct me if I'm mistaken. There was an intellectual movement. I mean, there's still vestiges of it, obviously, that it seemed to be, to me, influenced by Marxist thought and other ideologies, but that did just preach this message almost identical that religion is antithetical to science, religion is antithetical to progress, religion is antithetical to reason and rationality and evidence, and is bad and nothing but bad, right? And that was a prevalent intellectual view in parts of the 19th century and earlier, wasn't it?
It was, and certainly all the questions raised by Darwinism, as well as Marxism and later Freud, that's all there. And it's very important in trying to understand attitudes toward religion and so on. What I was getting at is that they posit or go along with the idea that there is a constant warfare between science and religion that is as true today. In fact, they see it going back to the ancient world, to Rome and Greece and so on. And I'm simply pointing out that that's a narrative that's no longer used by historians, including historians of science. That's not to deny. I mean, after all, agnosticism was a word that was made up in the 19th century in response to some of the new science and Darwinism and so on. People arguing that, well, these are questions we can't answer, so we're agnostic. We don't know. So, yes, it's very much part of the 19th century. But again, what I found is that they were distorting that history and, again, manipulating it for their predetermined conclusions.
And let me ask you this. It's a little off topic, but it directly relates. Why do you think that, obviously this 19th century view of religion is resurrected in Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and those guys, but why do you think mainstream historians dropped that religion as the enemy of science, reason, progress, blah, blah? I mean, to me, it's obviously ideological and hard to support, but when did the view switch in historians?
Well, I would put it this way, that, and again, the history of science is not my strong suit, but I've read enough books about it and used it in teaching that historians of science are trying to be more objective. And on the one hand, you can see the stress and strain over religion and one of the courses I took many, many, many decades ago in graduate school was called Religion and the Rise of Skepticism. And you can see the development of skeptical attitudes toward religion from the 17th century on. That's very important. It's a big topic. But historians writing about this don't take a view that there is inherently warfare between science and religion. Some have pointed out, for example, on the other side, why is it that science emerged out of a Christian society? In other words, are there roots of modern science in in the history of Christianity? And many would argue, yes, going back to scholastic thinkers in the 13th century. So again, this is getting out of my depth in a way, but I know enough about the general approaches. Again, a lot of it is how you put this into context. And again, with the new atheists, that's not their interest. Their interest is in finding stuff that will support them. So the idea of a constant, never-ending war between reason and science on the one hand and religion and superstition on the other fits their playbook, so to speak.
To the best of my knowledge, all the major universities in Europe prior to the late 20th century were built by Christians, the church. If not the Catholics, then the Anglicans, the Lutherans, etc.
Sure, the university is as we know it today. I mean, it's basically a medieval invention. Very wonderful one.
And based on Plato and Aristotle, for that
yes.
matter. And you also mentioned that their analysis, and I remember you even single out Steven Pinker here at least once.
Yeah.
Completely overlooking the role of the state in any atrocities that have happened in the last century or two. The last few centuries, just the development of the state. It's not there. Or Steven Pinker actually defends it as empirically, demonstrably just good, and religion is bad.
I tried to read it. Well, the book he wrote, seemed to be a case. I sometimes have my differences with social scientists who love to look at data, but often are not very good at history. And I thought, from what I could see in the book and in reviews, he was guilty of that. He would use quantitative measures, but comparing, what happened over several centuries with something that happened in a short period of time and other things and so on. His argument was true enough on the one hand that the amount of violence in modern societies is we're pretty sure much less than in the Middle Ages and so on. And that's because of political authorities. I mean, the bobbies, the 19th century, the Metropolitan Police Force in London, that was a new adventure. A new venture, a new way of keeping peace in the city so you didn't get, robbed when you went out after dark. So that's all true enough, but on the other hand, it ignores the state. If the state on the one hand has brought about more safety and security in our daily lives, it also is capable of massive destruction, violence, and death, as we've seen in the 20th century, and whether it's Hitler's Germany or Stalin's Russia or Pol Pot's Cambodia. And it seemed to me that Pinker had an argument to make here, trying to use facts and figures, but again was ignoring maybe half of what was going on.
So Steven Pinker deserves criticisms for sloppy scholarship too, then.
Well, from my point of view.
Fair enough. No, fair enough. You're not the first one to notice Professor Pinker doing that. He's a linguist.
Even though I was doing, as you say, the main three guys, I was looking for their allies, and we'll get to the end of the book later, but what was bothering me was the way some of these attitudes were kind of seeping into mainstream. I'd run into it reading journalistic pieces and so on. It was this idea that, well, sort of as we all know, religion has been the main cause of intolerance and conflict and so on, and that's not true. That's historically is not true. It's a much more complicated, nuanced, and so forth picture than that.
Journalistic sources now will often make statements like that about religion and science in conflict, or bad things about religion and history, and they appear to be frequently simply citing the likes of Dawkins, Harris, and some of these other new atheist people without knowing there's a problem with their scholarship. Well, okay, so why don't we move on to Europe up to 1600, and what were you trying to accomplish in this section?
Well, that's where it's dealing with Middle Ages and the Renaissance and period and so forth. And again, in the older view.